So Tania Unsworth is joining me in the reading corner today. Tania is a writer and daughter of the celebrated novelist Barry Unsworth. She spent her early itinerant years travelling around Greece and Turkey with her family before they settled in Cambridge. She now lives in Boston, Massachusetts. Tania has written for adults and for children. The Girl Who Thought Her Mother Was a Mermaid is a poignant mystery about facing your fears in the search for truth. The Time Traveller and the Tiger, Tania's most recent novel, is an ecological adventure involving, as the title makes clear, time travel. Set partly in 2020 Britain and in 1946 India, at the beginning of this story, the heroine, 12-year-old Elsie, is rather reluctantly sent to stay with her great-uncle John. An encounter with a tiger skin rug sets her mind whirring, and an encounter with an extraordinary flowering plant transports her back to India, where she will encounter live tigers and their hunters. It's a beautifully written story that captures the full majesty of the tiger. It's a story of friendship, social injustice, conservation, and importantly, self-discovery. Tania joins me today from Boston to talk about this latest work. Welcome, Tania.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you here. Before we talk about your human characters, I have to talk about what was such a large presence in the story, the tigers, and in particular your tiger. He has an almost mythic presence in the story, and I sensed a little bit of a reworking of Kipling's Shere Khan, who, like your tiger, is lame or has a problem with his leg. Was that in any way an inspiration for you?
Yes, of course. I read the Jungle books avidly when I was little and reread them again recently. But in terms of Shere Khan, I always, even as a child, felt that he was a very wronged figure. He was sort of a victim of fixed identity, I guess, like all those animals that Kipling wrote about. And I couldn't help thinking, even as a child, that even though he's cast as the villain, Shere Khan is actually all the time in the complete right. He's right to fear man, he's right to resent man, and right to see man as the real enemy. So when I came to write about my tiger, I wanted to write about a different kind of animal, which has real agency, that isn't a generic figure or, like Shere Khan, something with a fixed identity, but an animal with the power to change the future, an animal of importance to the world, as it were.
So when we read about your tiger, it's very clear to me through the writing that you are in awe of them. It comes through in the nuggets of information that sprinkle the narrative. And a lot of those nuggets of information make you gasp in awe yourself as a reader. I wondered, as you were writing about your tiger, whether you had to guard against putting in too much exposition. It's beautifully sprinkled through the narrative. So I just wondered if you knew so much about them that you had to kind of restrain yourself.
It's so funny you should say that, because that's exactly what happened. In the writing of the book, I almost got derailed by doing the research. I became so obsessed with tigers. I read about 10 books cover to cover about them. I went to zoos to look at them. I drew them in my notebooks. I actually went to India to go and see wild tigers for myself too, which was sort of one of the highlights of my life. And yes, there was a point where I thought, I have so many interesting things to say about tigers. How can I cram them all into this book without, it becoming boring or just a sort of biology lesson about tigers? So it was quite difficult to leave out lots of things, but I did my best to sort of weave in some little facts and figures and just some of the more awe-inspiring stuff about them, because they really are the most extraordinary and magical and threatened animals. And when you see them in the wild, your heart just stops beating. It's amazing.
It occurs to me that we've gone straight into talking about the tiger, And I haven't really given you an opportunity to say much about the story and what it's about. So maybe we should set that up for listeners as well.
The story is about Elsie, who is a girl from the present day, who finds herself back in India, in the jungle, in 1946, almost by accident. And she's face to face with her own great uncle John, who's a boy of 12 years old himself. And he is on a tiger hunt. And Elsie knows, because he's told her when, in the present day as an old man, that one of the greatest mistakes of his life was that he killed a tiger once. So when she goes back in time and sees him on this hunt, she knows she has to stop him doing that. But it turns out that's sort of the least of her worries, because the two children are soon embroiled in a far bigger and more sinister adventure involving a group of very evil trophy hunters. And they're helped in their quest by a boy called Mandeep, who is the son of one of John's family servants. And he's a sort of born naturalist, and he is even more keen to save the tigers than Elsie is. So it's an adventure involving narrow escapes and evil villains, and just that whole fun idea of time travel, the idea that you can go back, change something small in the past, and then arrive home again to find that an awful lot of things have changed in your life and in the lives of people around you. So I think it's an exciting read.
It is exciting. It's thrilling. I wondered about the time travel element of the story, and whether it was always going to be set in this double time frame, or whether the original story was just going to be set in 1946 in India.
Well, I've always wanted it to be in two times. I'm attracted to time travel, I realise, because it's sort of the ultimate do-over. The idea that you can go back and change something. And it occurred to me quite early on that writing is like this too. You sit down, you write a draft of a story, and then you get to go back and do it over again and change things in it, and keep on doing that until you get it right. So sort of it has an appeal to me as a person who does lots and lots of rewrites of all my books. It was sort of inspired, the story itself came to me when I was thinking about my grandfather, who was part of the British Raj, in fact, and left India in 1947. And I used to go to his house as a child and see all these sort of relics of his life in India. There was his rifle up in the corner there still, and all these sort of knickknacks and sort of weapons, and there was a carved wooden Buddha on the mantelpiece and stuff like this. He was always seemed to be in a sort of time warp, and I just thought how amazing it would be to be able to go back and see him as a boy himself, and that was the sort of beginning of it. And of course, tigers have always been an obsession of mine, so it wasn't too hard to sort of put those two things together.
So Elsie goes back in time and meets her great uncle as a younger boy. And one of the delights for me was through their interaction, actually both as the older uncle and the child and the two children together, but talking about their relationship in India when they're both children. A lot of the humour that came through the dialogue and them both not quite understanding each other. I absolutely love that. So how easy or difficult was it to write that bit?
Oh, it was such fun. That was one of the easier parts. I find writing very, very difficult. So any part that's a little bit easier, I always really appreciate. I just love the idea that there's this boy, and the language of the 40s. I had fun sort of making him talk in that way, and Elsie not really understanding quite what he means. And then the huge gap of time and attitude between the two children. There's a moment at the beginning where Elsie accuses him of being sexist, and he doesn't understand that word, and he thinks she's talking about sex or something, and he gets very embarrassed. And she realizes that how much has changed in 70 something years. I didn't want to make it too obvious or preachy, but I wanted to also sort of explore a little bit the change in attitude from a girl in the present day to a boy in British India, and their attitudes to race and their relationship with others, and just to sort of explore that a little bit, because that's a sort of point where Elsie feels very uncomfortable at the, I guess, the racism that she sort of sees around her and that John is a part of without really understanding it himself.
I think one of the things that comes across is that you can have a friendly relationship, but there is still inherently racism at the root of that, and she's able to expose that in a way. And I guess that's one of the strengths of having somebody from the present go back in the past, because they can bring a different sensitivity to it, a different subjectivity to it.
Yes, exactly. And I felt right from the start very strongly that I didn't want John to be like a perfect kid. I didn't want him to be the sort of white savior kind of kid who isn't racist at all, and he understands, because that's just so unrealistic. And he was a boy in that time and place. And I wanted him to just be like that, but also begin to change his mind a little bit as the story went on, and begin to sort of dawn on him that, you know, his friendship with Mandeep is unequal, and at the point where he feels ashamed of the way he's treated him, even though he loves Mandeep. I try not to belabor that issue, but I wanted it just to throw that in there as a sort of reminder that it was a different time.
As you say, it's a story, not a sermon. So it's somehow being able to connect those ideas without it taking over the narrative, which you obviously managed to do so well. One of the things that struck me about your heroine, Elsie, is that she's described as being pretty unremarkable, unlike the main characters you would see at the cinema or indeed in books. And there's a fantastic description near the beginning of your story where it talks about these main characters walking down the street in the way main characters did, as if there was an outline that was twice as clear as everyone else's. I think you've got this wonderful turn of phrase that puts into words things that you've thought many times before but never expressed, so you express them for us so brilliantly.
Oh, thank you.
Anyway, Elsie is this very unremarkable in her eyes character, but she does have this alter ego called Kelsey, who appears in the stories that she writes. And so I think I'm bound to ask you if this is in part the appeal of writing for you, that you can be the character that you would like to be in real life.
That's a very good question, and it sort of goes to the heart of a lot of what this book was about for me. I love those girl characters in books and movies who are bold and feisty and can, you know, use a bow and arrow and all that stuff. But I wasn't a child like that. I wanted to be, but I was much more like Elsie, who, you know, just ordinary, you know, not special in any way, just an ordinary girl, but wanting to be different. And I wanted the book to be about the idea that even if you're an ordinary enough person, it doesn't mean that extraordinary things can't happen to you, or that at some points in your life you can become a main character in your own story. And to me, that's what Elsie does in this book. She spends most of it wishing she was a main character. And then at the end, I won't give it away, but she steps forward and actually does become the kind of main character that she's always dreamed of being. And this is also sort of reflected in John too. John has a similar urge. It's not a main character kind of idea, but he wants to be a sort of hero, and he constantly fails. But then again, at the end of the book, we see that despite himself, he does have his moment of heroism. So yes, and of course, when you write, you can be anybody you want. And so I love the idea of making characters fulfill their own dreams somehow, that even if it's not the way they think it's going to happen, even if it's just for a moment, to give them that gift that, you know, I would have liked to have given myself.
She has a duality about her character. When she's in the jungle, we see both sides of this. She's quite frightened by the spiders. I have to confess, I'd be terrified by a spider as big as my fist. But she also wakes one morning and is inspired by the way that the webs look in the early morning light. And so there's this kind of tension or dual experience between being fearful of something and really appreciating it and being in awe of it. And again, I wondered if that was part of your personality too.
It never occurred to me, Nikki, but it sort of is. I'm terribly fearful of everything, and I hesitate, and I'm terribly nervous. But there is this sort of feeling of sort of wonder I think I still have, that I had as a child, and I still hope I still have, where I can respond to my environment, especially nature. It sort of brings that out in me. I mean, the thing about Elsie is that even though she says she's not very special, for me, she does have a special characteristic, which I don't have, but I wish I did. Her special sort of power, as it were, is that she is able to make the best of things. She's able to stay cheerful and upbeat and optimistic. And it's a talent that we don't give that much credit, that ability, but it's really an amazing thing to be able to do that. And in the book, she sort of keeps the others going to some extent by her sort of buoyancy. So she's rather humble, but she's a trier. So I do love her for that.
You mentioned in your answer there about your awe of nature. Again, this comes through very strongly, not only with regard to the tiger, but all the living things in the jungle, particularly the insect life, the beetles. There's a lovely phrase where you talk about the wings of a beetle being like the opening of a treasure box. I mean, that just was just so beautiful. But also when you're talking about your wonderful tiger, and there are some chapters through this story which are written very closely to the point of view of the tiger. It's the tiger's thoughts that we're accessing. And I think the first chapter where that occurs is chapter 10. And I've wondered whether you would read a little bit for us.
Of course I will, yes. And just to sort of fill you in on what's just happened, the children, John and Elsie, have just spotted the tiger. And they don't know, but he's had a difficult time, and he's been driven out from his home, and something has happened to him, and he's dazed, and he hasn't noticed the children. So this is just chapter 10 from his point of view. The tiger ought to have seen them well before they saw him. He ought to have been able, had he wanted, to come within an arm's length of them, hidden in his own striped shadow, betrayed by nothing but a brief shiver of grass. Instead, he had simply walked into the meadow, moving in the way of all tigers, each massive paw placed outer edge first, each step a decision, the weight of his long body shifting as easily as ocean swell. But there was a hesitancy to his progress, a strange looseness in his limbs. Something had happened to the tiger that he could not understand. He paced uneasily with lowered head and flattened ears. It wasn't simply that he'd left his territory. It seemed as if he'd strayed from something even more important than that, a kind of path. He had been born on this path and had walked it all his life. It was the path of greatest advantage, where his feet fell the softest, and the cover was greatest, and the light tricked every eye but his. Never wider than the length of his whiskers, never louder than a snapping of a twig. The unrelenting path of the hunter, who knows he is also the hunted. Now he stood as though lost, his mind blunted by confusion. Something had happened. The tiger remembered only snatches, the dawn air full of the cries of men, a hammering of feet, the long grass beaten to a storm. He twisted, crouching to meet the threat, teeth bared. Then a stinging at his neck, and the ground shifting as if turned to swamp. Weakness seized him. He toppled and lay flat, felt the tremor of approaching steps. A shadow crossed his body. It smelled of something he had never come across before, a bitter, ashy scent, deep-laid and sickly stale. The tiger knew it was the smell of death. He rolled, caught the ground and bounded clear. He ran. He ran through a tunnel of fear, never reaching the light, the trees blurring and changing shape, until his hind legs buckled beneath him. He snarled and hauled himself forwards, vast shoulders straining, the snap and crash of branches a dim roar in his head. He was slipping, falling headlong into empty space. Water carried him. Daylight. He lay high up on the bank, under thin cover, his eyes fixed on a figure at the river's edge. It sat with its back to him, the size of a monkey, hunched like a monkey too, the same intent angle of the head. The tiger felt no hunger. He was too dazed for that. But his mind briefly cleared with a relief so strong it was almost gratitude. This he knew. This. The intent crouch and the locked gaze, the inching advance, each step the sum of 1,000 calculations leading to a single deadly point. He blinked and pulled back his head. He was mistaken. It was not. He heard a shrill cry. A stone struck his side and he staggered, terrified by his own loss of balance. He wheeled and tumbled down the riverbank, clawing at the spinning sky. He swam, his huge paws beating beneath him, making for the opposite bank, and scrambled out, water sheeting off his back. Then he set off, his pace dogged, yet aimless, his senses dulled. He had been walking like this for several hours when he finally arrived at the meadow. Now he paused, uncertain of direction, and swung his head slowly around, catching, too late, the movement in the corner of his eye.
Beautiful. And there are several chapters through the book where we return to the tiger's point of view. What we haven't talked about so far is the other jeopardy, if you like, in the story, which is the big game hunting. And you have a villain who's as bad as any villain could be. I think the description of his study or his room, where just about everything is made from an animal part, is probably one of the most obscene things that you can imagine reading. It's really shocking. So without giving too much of the story away, because we don't want to do that, can you tell us a little bit about this aspect of the story?
Somehow in my mind, I imagined it as sort of a kind of Heart of Darkness moment almost, where you go into the jungle and you find the sort of ultimate evil. And in this case, it's an expression of the complete and cynical and avaricious and grotesque exploitation of animals. And I don't think it's a particularly unrealistic depiction. When you look at those old pictures of tiger hunts in India or anywhere really, you see the corpses piled high and the skins and just the multitude of carnage and destruction. And it was also sort of inspired by there's a museum in Boston, the Museum of Science, and they have this reconstruction of a room that was once owned by this I think it was African guy. I don't know who he was, some general or bigwig in Africa, white guy. And this room is just like full of things made out of animals. It was his trophy room, I suppose. And there's all sorts of horrible skins hanging from the walls and bits of heads, and it's really gruesome. And I took that as an inspiration, and I think in the book I made it more exaggerated. I made it so the room in my book is absolutely every single thing in it is made out of an animal or part of an animal. And I think what I felt was horrible about it is that you don't realize that at first glance, because the animal parts have been made to look like other things. It's only when you're there for a little bit that you realize that actually It's just bits of animals they've been made out of. And I wanted there to be this sort of nightmarish feeling to it.
Right down to the monkey paws that was a kind of handles on the drawer. Can you imagining opening that drawer? I need to come back to Mandeep at this point, because he's the sort of balance, he's the counterbalance to the big game hunters, I feel. He's the one with that deep empathy, even more than Elsie and John, really. He's the one that's got that counterbalance aspect to him.
Yes, absolutely. And even though John, loves the forest, and Elsie is a child of the modern world, cares about animals and stuff, Mandeep has much more skin in the game. It's his forest. Being Indian, he's the real inhabitant of that place. The others are just visitors, even though John's been there all his life. And so Mandeep has a passion that runs deeper, and has a sense of responsibility for it that's different from the others. And he is fundamentally hurt when the forest is threatened. And it gave me great satisfaction in the book to give him a happy ending.
I have to say, reading this book, I know that every book must be personal to a writer, otherwise he wouldn't write it, but this felt incredibly personal, this story. And I just wondered what you felt most pleased with yourself for having written it.
I think I'm most pleased about the way I was able, because I actually went to India. What happened was I wrote a first draft and the whole story was there, but I couldn't bring it to life somehow because the setting, I'd only been looking at pictures on Google Images, just sort of pictures of the forest, and it just wasn't enough. So I took a risk and went to India and went on to these tiger reserves, and absolutely completely fell in love with the countryside. I felt like it was the closest thing to Narnia this side of the wardrobe. It was just so beautiful, and I wanted to put that into the book. And I think what I'm most pleased about is that I got a little bit, I think, of how I felt about the place into the book.
That's so interesting hearing you say that, because if you could see my notebook here, I've put "This feels like Narnia."
Oh, really? Oh, that's
Yes.
so great.
Well, obviously there's the house and the relationship with the great uncle, and then this transportation through the flower into a different kind of Narnia, and that's what I've actually got written in my notebook. So
well, Narnia is just always a massive influence. I mean, I still think I'm going to get to Narnia at some point.
Yeah. Do you think you'll write about India again?
Oh, I hope so. I'm not sure. I'm working on a book set in America at the moment.
Is it an adult book that you're working on next, or children?
Oh no, I've given up writing for grown-ups, Nikki. I'm on the side of children now. I find them really thrilling as readers. I think children's books are so important, as they set your framework as a reader. And they're so important, the books you read when you're a child, and they can make the difference between making a reader for life or not. And I think maybe part of me has never completely grown up either, completely. So I sort of feel much more comfortable in creating those worlds that children can relate to.
Well, I'm delighted, because it means we're going to keep you in the world of children's books, and that means we've got more lovely titles to come. Can I just thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today in the Reading Corner, Tania? It's been absolutely wonderful to catch up.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you for inviting me. It's lovely.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.